nearing 6 years ago, because as you might imagine, such an event will definitely change your perspective on a lot of things. At least you hope it will. Sometimes it's difficult for me to talk about some of these things, and so I have to have a crutch with my notes. I hope that's all right. That way I can stay on path. I was going to try to show a video, but I don't, short one. But instead, I think what I'll do is email the link to you. Video done by the New York Times that gave kind of an overview of the Westgate Mall massacre and how it unfolded. But you might enjoy seeing that on your own. And again, it's only about 2.5 minutes long. But what it really illustrates is not only the location of the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, but also the government's response, how police and Kenya Defense Forces mobilized, and what really became a 4-day siege that ended up 71 people killed and almost 200 wounded. And in the confusion, there was a lot of news reports about large numbers of Somali Muslim terrorists. Al-Shabaab was the group that took credit for this. But actually there were only 4, or at least I saw only 4. There may have been some other supporters behind the scenes leading up to the massacre itself. But
Scott, this was in Nairobi, Kenya, right?
Right. Yeah. It'll be 6 years on September the 21st. What's sad, obviously, is that the story remains relevant. I would love for this to be such ancient history that it's of no longer of any interest. But some of my friends later were caught up in the massacre at the University in Garissa, which happened just a couple of years after the Nairobi massacre. And just to help put this in perspective of why it happened, there's been a civil war in Somalia for quite some time, and United Nations was supporting the Kenya Defense Forces in keeping mostly Muslims from using the Kenya border to run weapons and other supplies, but also the Al-Shabaab was kidnapping Kenya citizens and holding them for ransom. So UN and KDF, as far as the Somalians are concerned, invaded, got involved in their civil war, still are. And Al-Shabaab created this scheme to murder people in Nairobi as retribution for the invasion of their country by United Nations and Kenya Defense Forces. And so for whatever it's worth, there's the motivation behind it. So let me, if you don't mind, let me start with something that might sound a bit disconnected, just as a little bit as to my faith. A friend of mine, one of my colleagues, a much loved teacher of theology at Vanderbilt, he was lecturing. One of his course was on the world's great religions, and during that course, he didn't talk about his own faith because I think he felt like, as he was talking about all religions, he was going to represent them fairly. Anyway, late in the class, one of his students asked him, "You've not discussed your own faith, and we're curious. What is it that you believe?" And after a pause, my friend said, as was his nature, quietly so, said, "Ask those who know me what they think I believe." And scares me. I would not stand the test well if my friends were out to believe. And what kind of example do I provide? What do my words and actions say about the God that I profess to follow? That scares me, but nonetheless, all of us who call ourselves Christians then are evaluated by that question. So let me say this: that if there's anything of good report about me, anything that would cause someone to believe I'm a good man, there's been so many pieces to this, and we all have this story that has so many paths that come together. You know, for me, growing up in a Methodist parsonage was, as you might imagine, significant. Military academy, what I learned on the football field at Texas A&M or the military drill field there, 40 years of trying to serve others around the world, and this group as well. All of you have contributed to the puzzle that makes up who I am. And so I very much appreciate not only being invited to speak today, but being invited into this group and allowed to participate. I'd like to reference a piece of scripture that's a favorite of mine. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. And so I'm thankful for the example of your lives and being part of my life's journey, because I know I'm not alone in it. And in fact, I feel that in many of the things I do, that I'm accompanied by a great crowd of witnesses. Many of them dear souls in my life who are no longer with me, but who were gracious enough, who were kind enough to share their life when I needed that. And so, anyway, I know humor over the internet's difficult, but let me share with you just a story real quickly from my past as well that might give you some insight to my faith, and also just being honest with you, the struggle I've had with that forever. When I was in school in England, our chapel on campus had been part of a Cistercian monastery. It was a beautiful chapel. And every week someone different spoke. And on this one occasion, one of the Dons was speaking, and he was standing at a beautiful eagle lectern, surrounded on both sides or by candles. That was the primary light. And of course, this was during the day, and there was wonderful sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. He had a tendency to drone, and so I wandered. I wasn't really listening, and in fact, I was watching. I remember it very distinctly: dust motes floating in the air, and the different colors that they were. And I was actually thinking about Archbishop Laud, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury and had been beheaded. And he was buried in his pieces parts in the chapel so that people wouldn't be able to claim his body, his enemies. And so I'm not sure his head was with his body. And I was thinking, I wonder which part of Archbishop Laud that is floating in front of me. And I heard the Don say, "Some of you are frivolous, of course." And it caused other people who were slumbering a bit to kind of wake up, and he had a puzzled look on his face as well. And so he said it again, "Some of you are frivolous, of course." And he continued to look puzzled, and he looked at his notes very closely, held him closer to the candles, and he says, "Oh, I do beg your pardon. Some of you are followers of Christ." I try to be a follower of Christ, and sometimes I'm better at it than others. But anyway, so I had worked many years on different occasions in Kenya, and had been there for a couple of weeks, actually facilitating some training for a first-time gathering of Methodist-related college, university, and seminary presidents and board chairs. And we had concluded the day before the Westgate Mall attack, which happened on a Saturday. I had many years before, with an Anglican priest, helped form a company in Kenya that sold flies for fly fishing. We had created the business in order to create jobs. It never made us a profit. In fact, we had to raise money to fund it all every year. But it created about 40 jobs, and these fly tires were amazing. And I was going to meet the young man who had headed it for 10 years, mall to buy a piece of computer equipment, and he kept being delayed. And finally, I told him, I'm just going to go on my own. I had a favorite restaurant there that we were supposed to meet. It was called the Art Cafe, and had an outdoor seating area that bordered the entrance to the mall. The mall, by the way, is very upscale. You would love to go to it. It would be welcome in any city. It's gorgeous. It was a huge destination for people on Saturday, particularly expatriates. As on Saturday, the mall was difficult to reach. My driver, who I'd used for many years, a good friend, I told him, Leonard, you can't get me close. Drop me off at the gate of the Oshawa Indian Cultural Center, and I'll just cross through their campus, go out their back gate, empties onto the Westgate Mall parking lot. And that's what I did. And I was walking up to the entrance of the mall when a white car drove up, 4 men in it, dressed in civilian clothes. A man with a walkie-talkie who was a security guard but was not uniformed and unarmed walked up to the car, I'm sure to tell them that they can't park right there at the entrance. And as he walked up to the car, the man in the back seat shot him in the chest. Then the 4 men got out. 2 immediately threw hand grenades into the outdoor seating area of the Westgate, of the Art Cafe, where I was headed. And they were using Soviet-era grenades, and so only one of them went off. But that was enough. Those 2 started shooting people at the entrance. And 2 others walked past me, but I was hiding behind a bush in a traffic circle right there by the entrance. And 2 walked past me, killed the security officer guarding the multi-level parking garage that sat next to the mall, killed another security person who was on the ramp. And they headed up to the top of the parking garage where there was a large tent set up by a radio station that was offering a cooking demonstration that was primarily attended by young mothers and their children. And they began to kill them, including throwing hand grenades under cars and as those women and children would try to hide. So you had 2 groups, 2 men at the entrance who were shooting people in their cars and shooting people who were hiding like me. And then they walked into the mall itself. Many of you probably have seen the video of the murders right there at the entrance. As they were shooting, the 2 who stayed at the entrance were shooting people on the ground around me. A young mother jumped up, I suppose much like a flushed quail. She had an infant in her arms and she was dragging a 4-year-old. She ran right to me. It caused us to be very visible. And I expected her to be shot in the back at any moment. But for some reason, they didn't take notice of us or didn't pay attention to us. I pushed her behind the bush where I was, and I told her if she would follow me, I knew a possible safety area. My idea was, and you didn't know where other terrorists were going to come from. Because of my military school experience, I knew what an AK-47 sounded like, and I sure knew what grenades were. And I knew this wasn't a carjacking gone bad or a drug deal. This was heavier. And so I didn't know where other attackers may come from. And my goal was to work back through the parking lot to the back gate of the Indian Oshawa Cultural Center, because it was guarded always by armed Hindu militia. And if we could get to the gate with its high wall, I figured we'd be safe. And so that started a journey that this young mother and her two children and I took. I carried the 4-year-old, she kept her infant, and we just started leapfrogging behind cars. The two men on the terrorist on the top of the garage, then when they finished killing all the easy targets, they then started firing down into the parking lot where we were. And so there was always sometimes aimed, but mostly indiscriminate fire. And so it took us quite a while to move through the parking lot. And when we bumped into 3 Hindu men hiding behind a car, one of them had a cell phone in his hand and he was crying because his daughter and niece were in the mall. And the phone number that had shown up on his cell phone was his daughter's number, but it was not his daughter on the line. Someone had picked up her phone and hit redial, I'm assuming, and was screaming for help. And then the phone went dead. And so he's in shock, what's happened to his daughter, what's happened to his niece. And I told the 3 Hindu men if they would follow me, the 7 of us would work our way through the parking lot to the Oshawa Center, and that's what we did. It took us about 30 minutes because of the fire that continued to come back and forth. So I'm going to unveil a couple of other pieces of the story as we go along, but I want to share with you some of the takeaways that I continue to struggle with. And I studied history and economics, so I'm sure not a theologian, and I've worked for several different denominations. My first job, in fact, as a fundraiser was with the Jesuits. And so my theology is all mixed up, but my dad taught me that there's a magnetic north. And if I would focus on Jesus Christ, all the other things that tend to be man-made wouldn't bother me too much. We have a way of screwing everything up. And if I would just focus on Jesus Christ, then I would never be far from what is right. So I've tried to take that to heart. So my first takeaway, if I can share that with you, is I've learned now that my radical starting point on everything is gratitude and prayer. And I haven't always been that way. I'm grateful for my upbringing as a minister's son. I'm grateful for the amazing opportunities I've had to serve around the world, particularly in Africa. I'm thankful for all the prayers and the support that over the years I've received from friends and others who knew about my experience. I'm even thankful for experiencing these kind of things because, well, the best lessons probably come from when we suffer. And I hate to admit that I'm not strong enough because I do still suffer from some of the impact of what I experienced. But I spent a whole life worrying a great deal and praying very little until this happened. And since the massacre, I have the same morning prayer and it has two pieces to it. And this is the way it goes exactly. God, are you kidding? As inadequate as I am to get to do what I do, then thank you for prevenient grace. This being the case, all of this is your fault. Please help me know how to impact someone's life positively today. And that's the way I begin every day. To heart, now I pray mightily for the peace of understanding that reconciles witnessing the horror that I witnessed, but also the guilt that I carry. I carry for surviving when so many around me didn't. And often people, they mean well. They will say to me, well, God has a bigger plan for you. God has a different idea for the rest of your life. And I know they mean well, but what it has led me to, and it did early on, is that I realized there are 71 people who don't have the chance to do more with their lives. And most of them, if not all of them, were brighter and more capable, and many of them younger than me, and so had much more promise. So I carry this feeling of responsibility that I have to do something, and no wasted opportunities, to help make up for the 70. So anyway, I pray also that God will grant me atonement for the wrongs that I've committed in my life. I pray that I can provide some sort of reparation for those wrongs that I've done to others, but and the injury maybe that I've caused in others' lives, but particularly, and this is what drives the work I do now, particularly when I pass those needing assistance and I didn't respond. Another takeaway, people ask me, was God present? And if God was present, why did Westgate happen? Bill knows the answer to this far better than I do. But here's my simple take on this. First off, I'm sad to say to you, it's still a mystery. My take is, though, that as unique creations of God, we weren't created to be robots that only did what was told of us to do. That we were given this wonderful gift of free will, and we have a choice to do good and evil. And we live in a wonderful world and a broken world at the same time. And evil comes, at least in my opinion, when God's not present. And I know that the murderers at Westgate lived in darkness. I looked in their eyes. The two who went up the ramp to kill women and children walked within 25 yards of me. And I saw their eyes. And there was no compassion. There was nothing there. I have no doubt that God was present for everybody who suffered at Westgate. When I was 18 at military academy, my father died. And I didn't have any opportunity to have last words. I was always haunted by what he would have said to me if he could have. And I remember being called to the commandant's office by cadet guard in the middle of the night to hear the message from my father's, his best friend and his physician. And he's telling me that my father died. He also told me that he had never seen a man die so bravely. That my father had walked to his car and they had driven to the emergency room, and my father died in the emergency room after they got there. But my father was expressing concern for the staff around him and trying to make them feel better about his increasingly desperate situation. In the parsonage, my mother and dad would talk about saving or winning souls to Christ, and that if you ever did that, you would want to do so again and again and again. And in my immature understanding of religion, I didn't understand what they were really talking about. And it wasn't until Westgate that I did. finally I understood that if you ever save a soul to Christ, it changes your life. It changes so much because in a sense you get a glimpse of the face of God. And for me, it was the same. I was put in a position to help save the lives of 6 people. And now I get it. If to save a life or to save a soul is to literally save the world. And you'll want to do it again and again and again. I also know about this God of his present thing is that Paul said, for me, death is gain. And this is a tough message, I know. Death is the only entrance into Christ's presence. I think Paul believed that death was an immediate entry into the presence of the Lord. I believe that that death for us is union and reunion, union with Christ and reunion with those that we love who've gone before us. Each of us have our own crucibles, our own Westgates. I try to remember a poem by Dietrich Bonhoeffer that helps me weather these kind of things. He wrote this in his Gestapo prison cell the last Christmas he was alive. The poem is By Gracious Powers. By gracious powers so wonderfully sheltered and confidently waiting come what may, we know that God is with us night and morning and never fails to greet us each new day. This is the tough part of the message, though, that I've had to come to understand is that the Bible makes it very clear that having faith in Jesus, being a Christian, does not guarantee a good life or a long life. And I can only hope that it guarantees a perfect eternity. But we want comfort and we want a good, fun experience. But I guess if you look at the disciples, supposedly only one of them died of old age. Being a follower of Jesus doesn't promise us, particularly if we play it out as we should, and not ignore those who need help that we pass, that we may not live a good life or a long life.
Scott, we only have a couple of minutes left. What an amazing story. But I wanted to see if anybody wanted to comment on your story before we leave. That's just an amazing witness.
Could I go first? Because I have to drop off for another meeting. Scott, I've known you the whole time I've been here, and you and Susan, and we had a wonderful lunch over at Rojo near the church. Gosh, it was like last fall, I think, sometime where you were so kind to listen to me and what all we've been through at the church. And I got to get a little glimpse of your story, but this was so deeply moving to me today, being a preacher's kid also and knowing what you were experiencing about your father dying. I just want to thank you. What an incredible story, and the way you told it and the way you shared your faith. It's really very touching to me today. So I want to thank you. And I'm sorry that I have to drop off, but gosh, that was great. Really good.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We only have a few minutes. Any other comments? It's hard to top that story.
I would like to give Scott maybe a 1-minute summation or something before we all leave.
Okay. Scott, can you do that?
Well, what I'd like to do, if it's all right, is I'd like to share with you a prayer I wrote. I canceled my flights home I didn't want to be seen as an American running when things got tough. And I ended up signing up for the Kenya Red Cross as they collected blood for the survivors. And thousands of people lined up at a military parade ground not far from the mall where I was assigned. And I wrote a prayer. I was exhausted. I was a common laborer. I didn't help collect blood. I hauled water and food and whatever else. And I was exhausted because the days were long and people lined up because they didn't have anything to give but their blood. but they wanted to help their fellow men. And it saved my sanity, because I was working with Muslims and Christians and Hindus and people from Somalia and people from Kenya. And so it made me understand that we're much more alike than we're different. What I'd like to do is offer a prayer that I wrote at that time, kind of as a close, and I can answer other questions if you wish, but would that be all right instead of a summation?
Sure.
So during the second day of the siege, when I was standing in place, resting for a moment, the fire from the mall was rising, and it made me realize, as I'm surrounded by Kenya Defense Forces in relative safety, that people were dying just a mile away. And so this is the prayer I wrote. It has two parts. The first part was for me, and the second part was for us. So it ends with the benediction, the last line of the benediction my father said as he ended his Sunday evening worship services. It's also on his tombstone. So if you join me, Almighty God and most merciful Father, give me faith shining through my tears, peace and hope within my heart. Provide me grace to forgive this hurt. Help me live my life worthily. Direct us to do what is right for Jesus' sake and the sake of peace and good conscience. Make us bold enough to confront the face of evil and of wrong. Give each of us the strength and courage to be leaders in a church, nation, and world hungry for hope and leadership. Lord, help us love thee more and love one another more. Amen.